My name is Samuel Briggs. I'm 58 years old, a retired Army logistics officer with more than 3 decades of service. People assume that life slows down after you hang up the uniform, but for me it only started to make sense once I left the battlefield behind and moved to a place where silence wasn't a threat. It was a gift. That place was a small lake cabin in northern Georgia passed down from my grandfather, Earl Briggs. He built it in 1959, long before the HOA ever existed, before the gated communities sprouted like mushrooms around the lake, before the rules, the noise, the self-righteous newsletters. The cabin sat right on the eastern bend of Winding Pine Lake, its cedar panels darkened with age and weather, the dock stretching out like a quiet sigh into the still water. I came here to be alone, not in a bitter, angry kind of way, but because the world had gotten too loud, too complex, too political. After 2 failed marriages, a shoulder full of shrapnel, and nights that still woke me up in cold sweat, I didn't want to explain myself to anyone. I just wanted to fish, chop wood, read old detective novels, and drink coffee as the fog rolled over the lake like smoke from an invisible fire. The property was modest, half an acre, an old boathouse, a dock I rebuilt with my own hands, and the cabin 2 rooms and a screened porch. But every board, every nail, every squeaky stair had a story. Some from my grandfather, some from me. He left it to me in his will before I ever thought I'd need it. Back then, I had no idea I'd end up seeking refuge in it, nursing my wounds, visible and not. The lake was clean, cold, and beautiful. No motors, no jet skis, just rowboats and the occasional kayak from city folk renting Airbnb houses across the cove. It was heaven. And the best part? The land and lakebed beneath my dock were mine, titled, deeded, surveyed, and filed away in an old green folder my grandfather kept locked in his desk. I had the documents. I had the maps. What I didn't have yet was the foresight to imagine that someone would try to take it all from me. The first time I saw the red golf cart with the white HOA letters painted on the side, I was trimming the rose bushes by the front porch. It was early April and the dogwoods were blooming. The woman who stepped out had that stiff-shouldered posture I remembered from junior officers trying to look more important than they were. She wore a visor, carried a clipboard, and didn't introduce herself, just looked me up and down like I was something she needed to log as a violation. "You the owner of this cabin?" she asked, voice clipped. "I am," I said, not bothering to stand up. She looked at my army t-shirt, then at the rose shears in my hand, and then at the house behind me like she'd found a glitch in the matrix. "This structure appears to be within the recreational buffer zone of Evergreen Shores," she said. I blinked. "What's Evergreen Shores, our HOA? This whole community is under it now." I stood then, wiped my hands, walked down the porch steps. "No, ma'am," I said. "This property predates your HOA by about 40 years. We're outside your development. This is private land deeded in 1959. She raised her eyebrows like I'd just spoken Latin. Then she tapped something on her phone and mumbled, "We'll be in touch." I watched her drive away in her HOA cart, dust trailing behind her. That should have been the end of it. But deep down, I knew better. I knew that look in her eyes. The look of someone who believed authority gave her ownership. Someone who wouldn't stop just because she'd been corrected. Still, I let it go for a while. Spent my days as I always did, morning coffee on the porch. Fishing lines cast just as the sun cracked. The tree line occasional runs into town for supplies. But I started noticing little things. Survey flags, pink ribbons tied to trees near the path leading to the water. A drone buzzing overhead and hovering above my dock, longer than a curious tourist would. I took photos, logged every instance in a little black notebook. My grandfather taught me one thing better than war tactics. "Sam," he'd say, "people who try to take what's yours don't knock twice. They smile the first time. The second time they come with papers. Third time they come with a sheriff. That week I unlocked the old desk in the corner of the cabin and pulled out the green folder. Deed. Survey. Title. 1959. Signature from the county recorder's office. Clearly marked boundaries showing the cabin sitting just outside the HOA limits. I made 6 copies. Laminated one. Placed another in my truck, one in the freezer. He always said, fireproof your most important things. And another in my backpack. I wasn't paranoid. I was prepared. Then came the envelope. Cream-colored no stamp slipped under my screen door while I was out fishing. It read, Notice of Non-Compliance. You are hereby informed that your property is in violation of Evergreen Shores HOA Buffer Ordinance. 12.4. Failure to respond within 10 days may result in enforcement action fines or removal. No name, no contact info, no HOA letterhead, just legalese printed on expensive paper. I smiled, because that's when I knew they didn't have a legal leg to stand on. But they were hoping I didn't know that. They were hoping I'd be intimidated, that I'd fold, that I'd abandon what was mine. But they didn't know who I was. They didn't know I'd spent 30 years studying regulations, terrain, and pressure tactics. They didn't know that my cabin wasn't just a house, it was a lifeline. That night, as a light rain danced on the lake, I poured myself a bourbon, sat on the dock, and whispered into the dark. You picked the wrong veteran, Karen. It didn't take long for Karen to come back. 2 mornings after the letter slid under my door, I heard the now familiar whine of the red HOA golf cart bouncing down the dirt access road. The sun was just peeking over the pines, casting long golden streaks across the lake, and I was halfway through my first cup of coffee on the porch. She got out like she owned the place. Same visor, same clipboard. This time she wore a bright red polo shirt with Evergreen Shores board member embroidered above her heart in all caps. The kind of uniform that screams I invented rules I don't understand. Behind her were 2 more people, a man with a thick neck and wraparound sunglasses, and a younger woman clutching a tote bag covered in HOA pamphlets like they were holy writ. They stood at the edge of my property line, squinting at the lake, then at me, then at each other. Mr. Briggs' Karen called, not quite friendly. She waited like I owed her my time. I walked down the steps slowly, let the mug stay warm in my hand. I see you brought reinforcements, I said. She forced a smile. This is just a courtesy visit. I didn't invite them past the fence. I wanted it clear this wasn't their ground. She raised the clipboard like it was a badge. You've received our notice, I have. And do you understand the violation? Nope. Maybe you can explain it to me like I'm someone who's not part of your gated neighborhood. She frowned. The man with the sunglasses stepped forward. We've recently redrawn jurisdiction lines. Your property falls within the newly recognized buffer zone. I nearly laughed. I see. And what kind of authority does a private HOA have to redraw county-recognized boundaries? I pulled a laminated map from my back pocket. My land was deeded before your HOA existed. Here's the boundary. Here's my cabin. Here's your development over there, a full 100 yards past the ridge. Karen stiffened. That may have been true once, but the Evergreen Shores Development Agreement was updated last year. We have buffer rights now, and lakeside conformity guidelines. I took a sip of my coffee, then looked her dead in the eye. Ma'am, if you think some clause in a neighborhood handbook overrides a legal land deed filed in 1959, you're in for a hell of a time. The younger woman pulled out a stack of papers from her tote. These are the compliance expectations. You'll need to paint your exterior a uniform tan, remove the dock, and apply for retroactive construction permits. Her voice shook slightly like she wasn't used to confrontation. I let the silence stretch. Birds chirped in the distance. A fish jumped in the lake. Then I said, no. Karen narrowed her eyes. This isn't optional. Neither is trespassing, I said, nodding at my private property sign posted clearly on a tree near the dock. I took another slow sip. You're on my land without permission. That's a crime. You have 30 seconds to leave, or I call the actual authorities. For a brief second, no one moved. Then the man in sunglasses said, "Come on, Karen." Karen looked like she wanted to spit, but she turned and stormed back to the cart. Just before they left, she looked over her shoulder. "You can be difficult if you want, Mr. Briggs, but I promise we'll follow protocol. And when that happens, you'll wish you'd cooperated." I watched them go the golf cart bumping back down the path. They were quiet, but I knew that wasn't the end. That week I started receiving HOA bulletins in my mailbox, even though I wasn't on their mailing list. Color-printed newsletters boasting about property harmony and neighborhood beautification goals. Every issue included a new policy, a new rule, a new overreach. Then came the flagged photos. One morning I found a laminated picture of my cabin taped to my mailbox. Non-conforming structure. It read in big red font. No signature. No explanation. The next day it was my dock, then my canoe, then my satellite dish. They were documenting me like I was some kind of invasive species. I drove down to the county recorder's office with my folder. Sat with a clerk named Miss Geraldine who had worked there since God wore short pants. She pulled the same deed I had, the same survey, and she frowned. "This ain't the first time Evergreen Shores tried something slick," she said. "They've been expanding ever since their new board president took over." "Lady named Karen," I finished. She nodded. "Yup." She tried telling a widow on Willow Bluff that her chickens violated airspace aesthetics. Got slapped down real quick by zoning court. That made me smile. I asked for certified copies of all my documents. Filed a cease and desist letter through the county attorney's office. Mailed one to the HOA board, one to Karen directly, and one to myself just to frame it. Days passed. I thought maybe they'd back off. But I underestimated Karen's hunger for power. A few mornings later, I woke to the sound of men's voices, and then chainsaws. I bolted from the cabin and ran toward the lake. A landscaping crew hired by the HOA was trimming back the tree line near the edge of my dock. One of them was standing knee-deep in my property, chainsaw revving. "Hey," I shouted. They stopped, turned confused. I pointed. "You're trespassing. Drop the saw and back off now." Karen appeared from behind a bush, clipboard in hand. She looked smug. "These trees obstruct public lake access." I took a step forward. "There is no public lake access on my land. This is deeded property. You've just committed trespass, destruction of property, and illegal entry." She crossed her arms. "I have authorization." "From whom?" "Your board of bingo players." I pulled out my phone. "You've got 30 seconds to get off my land, or I press charges." She turned red, but the crew stepped back. One of them actually apologized under his breath. They left, but not before Karen took one last photo of my dock, zoomed in smug, like a cat who thinks it owns the fence. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat on the porch, running my fingers over the old map again. Tracing the property line. Tracing my patience. They were pushing harder. Testing boundaries. And the moment she said public lake access, I realized what this was all about. It wasn't just about my cabin. It was about the lake, about controlling it, monetizing it, owning what they had no right to claim. This wasn't just a nuisance anymore. It was a war over water, and I was going to fight it with every legal weapon I had. The next morning, a certified envelope arrived via courier. Not the mailman, an actual delivery guy in a blue polo clipboard in hand asking me to sign. From Evergreen Shores HOA, he said, glancing at the return address. I signed. He left. And I stood there holding the envelope like it was laced with poison. Inside was a 12-page notice. The header read, Second formal notice of non-compliance. Subject unauthorized private dwelling and dock within protected buffer zone. Fine assessment, $350. Day retroactive to date of initial violation. Below that were photos of my cabin dock and canoe, each labeled time-stamped. They had been building a file surveilling me, documenting planning. One paragraph in particular made my blood rise. You are hereby instructed to remove all non-conforming structures and accessories, including but not limited to the cabin dock, canoe satellite dish, external woodpile, and fire pit. Failure to comply will result in cumulative fines, lien initiation, and legal escalation. I sat down at the porch table, the documents spread out like battle plans. A lesser man might have panicked, but I'd seen worse threats with real bullets. Still, this wasn't war. This was bureaucracy weaponized. I called my old friend Terry from back in my logistics days. He was now a property lawyer in Atlanta, the type who kept code books on his nightstand. You're kidding, he said after I read him the letter. They're trying to issue fines retroactively. They don't even have jurisdiction over your land. They think they do, I said. They're basing it off some buffer ordinance, claiming recreational easement access to the lake grants them enforcement. Terry exhaled loudly through the phone. I'll send you precedent cases. But more importantly, document everything. Every conversation, every photo, every unauthorized entry. Already done. I told him about the photo on my mailbox, the illegal tree trimming the drone. He told me I could sue already, but I held back. Not yet. I needed them to overplay, to get sloppy. A few days later, the fines started arriving. First by mail, then by courier again, then posted literally stapled to a wooden stake they drove into the edge of my driveway, like some medieval declaration. One per day, each with a new amount. $350. Then $700. Then $1,050. Like compound interest built on audacity. I left them there piled at the edge like leaves. I wasn't going to validate their nonsense. But it escalated fast. By the end of the week, I received a notice of lien intent. They were threatening to place a lien on my cabin, my home. That night I walked down to the dock, sat at the edge with my feet dangling just above the moonlit water. The lake was calm, glass-like. A loon cried in the distance. I pulled the original deed from my back pocket, read the name of my grandfather in elegant black ink, read the county seal slightly faded, but still embossed with pride. Read the line that mattered most. Parcel 407B, including the structure and the 40 linear feet of shoreline, are privately held with full ownership of both land and waterbed. I wasn't crazy, I wasn't wrong, and I sure as hell wasn't backing down. The next morning, the HOA played their next card. A compliance officer came to my door. This one wasn't Karen. It was a man named Ray, mid-40s, polite but firm, wearing a badge-shaped name tag like he was some sort of sheriff. Mr. Briggs, I'm here to perform a visual inspection of your property perimeter, he said. I stepped onto the porch. You're trespassing. He raised a laminated paper. This is an HOA-sanctioned assessment form. And I'm not in your HOA. He hesitated. According to our expanded district filing, I cut him off. You got a warrant? No, sir. This is a standard procedure. I pulled out my phone. Then leave. You've got 10 seconds before I start recording and call the sheriff's department. He backed away, hands raised slightly like I was holding a gun instead of a smartphone. He muttered something about just doing his job and vanished down the trail. That evening, the drone came back. I could hear it before I saw it, high-pitched and insistent, hovering above my roofline like an insect with a camera. I watched it for a few minutes, then calmly retrieved my binoculars and snapped high-res photos of it hovering over the dock. Illegal surveillance. Trespassing via unmanned aircraft. I filed a report with the FAA just to be safe. Karen didn't know I'd been in charge of aerial logistics for half of NATO's drone corridors. She was trying to play chess with someone who had invented the map. A few nights later, something strange happened. I came back from town late, maybe 9 p.m., and as I parked my truck under the oak by the porch, I noticed something glinting in the moonlight near the dock. It was a raw metal stake. Freshly driven into the earth at the water's edge, wrapped in neon orange ribbon. Another one sat 30 feet away, and another just beyond that, forming a crooked, unofficial boundary across my shoreline. Survey markers. They were trying to draw my land again, unannounced, illegally. I pulled each one out one by one and laid them in a neat pile by the fire pit. Then I lit them on fire. Not out of rage, but out of ritual, out of principle, out of the same fire that had kept me alive through 30 years of campaigns, operations, and near-death moments. Karen was poking the wrong bear. And bears, when cornered, don't just bite. They plan. The next day, I printed out an entire dossier. Copies of the original deed and water rights. Photos of the drone. Time-stamped videos of the illegal inspection attempt. The FAA complaint. The county records. Affidavits from 2 neighboring property owners confirming the cabin's long-standing exemption from HOA jurisdiction. I emailed one copy to Terry, another to the county's property board, and another certified mail to Evergreen Shores HOA. The cover letter read, "To whom it may concern. You are hereby notified that continued attempts to extort, fine, trespass, or otherwise harass the lawful resident of Parcel 407B will be met with legal action in civil and criminal court. You have no jurisdiction over the property in question. You have no claim to the shoreline, lake access, or surrounding land. Your overreach has been documented in detail. Cease and desist. Respectfully, Samuel Briggs." I signed it in ink, sealed it with wax just for old-school flair, then sat back in my cabin and waited, because I knew what came next. Karen would either escalate again or she'd call the cops, and if she did, she'd be walking straight into her own ambush. It happened on a Wednesday. I remember because it was the only day of the week the bait shop in town got a fresh shipment of minnows, and I was in the middle of lowering my minnow bucket into the lake when I heard tires crunching gravel. Real tires, not golf cart ones. I turned slowly. A black and white patrol SUV with the county sheriff's emblem pulled into my driveway. My heart didn't skip a beat. It hardened. I'd been expecting this. 2 officers stepped out. One male, mid-30s, sunglasses still on despite the cloud cover. One female, older, serious, clipboard in hand. Behind them, Karen, standing smug and composed, arms crossed, like she'd just summoned the cavalry to crush a nuisance. She wasn't wearing her HOA uniform today. Just a crisp white blouse and tan slacks, the civilian costume of someone who thinks the law bends for convenience. I didn't move from the dock. The male officer approached first. "Morning, sir," he called. "Are you Mr. Samuel Briggs?" I nodded. "Sure am. I'm Deputy Carson. This is Deputy Reyes. We've received a report from the Evergreen Shores HOA regarding alleged obstruction of community lake access and unauthorized structures." I looked past him at Karen, who stood a few feet back, not saying a word, letting the uniform do her bidding. "Obstruction," I echoed. I gestured at the lake behind me. "Looks pretty unobstructed to me." Deputy Reyes stepped forward. "According to their documentation, the shoreline here is considered part of the shared buffer zone granted to Evergreen Shores HOA residents." I almost laughed. Instead, I reached behind me and pulled a sealed manila envelope from the cooler beside my bait bucket. "Here," I said, handing it over. "Original deed from 1959. Survey records from the county recorder's office. Waterbed rights included. This cabin and everything from the tree line to 15 feet into the lake is privately owned." Reyes opened it, brows furrowed as she scanned. Carson took off his glasses and leaned in. Karen took a step closer, but stopped when I raised a hand. "No, ma'am," I said. "You're not part of this conversation anymore." Karen's jaw clenched. "But I filed the complaint. I have every right." "You filed false claims." I interrupted, still calm. "This is a matter between property owner and law enforcement. You are neither." For a long beat, nobody said anything. Only the lapping of the lake and the whine of a distant lawnmower down the ridge. Reyes looked up. "This document appears valid." Carson nodded, turning to Karen. "Ma'am, did you provide counter-evidence to the claim of ownership?" Karen's eyes narrowed. "I have Evergreen's community bylaws and the buffer expansion documents." "Do those documents override county property records?" Silence. Karen didn't answer. She didn't blink, just stared. Carson sighed. "Ma'am, unless you can present legal documentation that disproves this ownership, we have no grounds to proceed. This is private land." Karen exploded. "You don't understand. He's using this dock to block residents from accessing the lake that violates our harmony standards, that violates our lakefront development plan." "Karen's own," I said evenly. "You don't own the lake. You rent proximity to it." Her face flushed red. "You think you're clever, don't you? You think you can hide behind some dusty deed while the rest of us follow the rules." I said. "I think I can stand on the law while the rest of you drown in bureaucracy." Carson cleared his throat. "Briggs, you're within your rights. We won't take further action." Karen's lips parted, desperate to argue, but Carson already turned to walk back to the car. Reyes handed me my envelope, gave me a brief nod, and followed him. Karen stood still for a moment longer, then stormed off without another word. But I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. That night, I pulled out the green folder again, added the police report number, logged the time date and officer names. I had learned one thing in my time abroad: the real war isn't won in moments of confrontation. It's won in what you record, what you archive, what you're ready to show when the lights come on. I started digging. If Karen was bold enough to fabricate claims to law enforcement, I wondered what else she was hiding under that HOA badge. I found her name on the Evergreen Shores website, Karen Billings listed as president of the board, with a photo that made her look more like a lifestyle coach than a legal authority. The website had links to board meetings, public planning notes, archived PDFs. Sloppy, unprotected. I found documents outlining their lakefront beautification initiative, a plan to build a private pier, sell permits to residents, and install a gated access point to the lake. And there it was. Phase 2. Secure control of Eastern Shoreline Parcel 407B, currently under informal dispute. Informal dispute. That meant they knew. They knew they had no legal ground. They were banking on intimidation, on me folding. But instead of folding, I printed everything. All of it. The planning notes, the cost projections, the board vote logs, none of which included community consultation. Then I made 2 copies and walked them across the lake to visit someone I hadn't spoken to in nearly a year. Her name was Barbara Gray, mid-60s, sharp as a tack, former city planner for the county before she retired and moved into one of the cottages on the South Bank. She was also one of the few people who had stood up to HOA Karen before and paid the price. They fined her for hanging wind chimes that didn't match the HOA-approved color palette. Then for planting tomatoes in a raised bed instead of flush to the ground. Then for letting her grandson ride a scooter on a sidewalk. They had humiliated her, but they didn't break her. She made tea as I laid out the evidence on her porch table. Her eyebrows rose higher with each document. When I was done, she said one thing: let's make this public. The next morning, Barbara and I printed packets and dropped them in 20 mailboxes. Then we created an email, Lake Freedom Alliance at protonmail.com. Mail to Lake Freedom Alliance at protonmail.com. Sent out a PDF to every property owner around the lake with a simple subject line. Do you know what your HOA is planning? Within 24 hours, I had 50 replies. 30 of them included stories like mine. Threats of fines for flags, forced repainting, bans on guests, falsified community votes, docks torn down in the night. It was bigger than me. This wasn't just about a cabin. It was about control. And Karen had just started a wildfire she couldn't contain. By week's end, I had 2 reporters scheduled to meet me by the lake. One from the local paper, one from a regional blog that specialized in HOA abuse stories. They brought cameras. I brought documents. Barbara brought coffee and banana bread. We stood on my dock, the same one they'd tried to erase, and we told our stories. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something different than anger. I felt clarity. Direction, purpose. They had tried to make me a target. Instead, they made me a symbol. I woke up the following Monday to a different kind of silence. Not the peaceful stillness of the lake or the soft rustle of pine needles. No, this was the kind of quiet that comes before a storm. A gut feeling I'd learned to trust over 30 years of reading the air before an ambush. And I was right. At 7:13 a.m., 2 county sheriff vehicles pulled up again. This time, not a routine patrol. Lights on engines running, and another vehicle behind them, a black SUV with tinted windows and Evergreen Shores Enforcement and Security Division on the side. They came with intent. I stepped onto the porch, boots, laced coffee in hand. My green folder was already sitting on the table. I'd been sleeping with it beside my bed like a loaded rifle. The lead deputy was someone new, Deputy Holt. Late 40s, broad shoulders, expression unreadable. Next to him was Karen again. She wore sunglasses and a hard smile. "Mr. Briggs," Holt said, tipping his head. "We're here in response to a formal complaint from the Evergreen Shores HOA. They claim you're illegally obstructing community lake access in violation of Municipal Code 4.11.72. I didn't even blink. I've provided documentation to Deputy Carson and Deputy Reyes confirming private ownership. You're welcome to review it again." "I have their notes," Holt said. "But this complaint includes new information. They're claiming the shoreline easement was revised under the Regional Water Access Protection Act passed 2 months ago. I raised an eyebrow. That act applies to public reservoirs. This is a spring-fed private lake not maintained or managed by the county. Want me to pull the Water Authority's map? Holt looked slightly surprised. Karen stepped forward. Mr. Briggs, this isn't a negotiation, she snapped. You're in active violation of community code. The board has voted unanimously to enforce a temporary easement. Until this is resolved, your dock is to be removed and the cabin vacated. I stared at her. Karen, you are not the government. You do not have the authority to evict me, much less remove structures on privately owned land. She smiled tightly. We'll see what the county says when this goes to court. It already has, I said. That caught her off guard. I pulled out a manila envelope and handed it to Holt. Inside was a stamped injunction filed just 2 days earlier, thanks to my lawyer friend Terry and a sympathetic judge who'd seen too many of these cases. The injunction froze any HOA action against Parcel 407B until a formal hearing. This is a protective order against attempted seizure, destruction, or financial penalties on my property, I said calmly. And it includes a clause against further harassment from HOA agents. That includes you. Holt flipped through the pages, then stepped aside to call his supervisor. Karen fumed. This isn't over, she said through gritted teeth. No, I agreed. It's just beginning. They left 20 minutes later without setting foot past the pine tree boundary that marked my edge of the lake. I watched their tires kick up dust, then walked down to the dock and dipped my fingers into the water. Still mine. Still cold. Still clean. But I knew what was coming. Karen wouldn't stop. She couldn't. This was no longer about a cabin or a shoreline. It was about control. And for people like her, losing control is worse than losing money. The next evening, a neighbor came by. Tommy Wilkes. Mid-30s young family lived 4 houses down from the edge of Evergreen Shores. He stood awkwardly at the edge of my property, holding a rolled-up blueprint tube. Mind if I talk to you? He asked. I nodded. He unrolled the document on my porch table. It was a site plan, a proposed expansion of Evergreen Shores to include a community marina projected to open next summer. And right in the middle of the proposed zone, my dock, my cabin. I work for the county's planning commission, Tommy said quietly. I saw your name on the parcel and remembered the HOA drama. I pulled this from a proposal packet Karen submitted under a recreational overlay district request. She's trying to steal the lake, I said. He nodded. And your land is the anchor. If she gets it, the marina goes through. But she can't, I said. Not legally. She's trying to backdoor it, he said. There's a loophole if she convinces enough property owners around the lake to sign a shared easement agreement. She can petition the county to rezone without touching your deed. Just surround you, like siege warfare. Karen couldn't win a frontal attack, so she was trying to choke me out through politics. I thanked Tommy, gave him a folder of my own with documents, maps, history. Then I called Terry. We need to go public, I said. Louder, bigger, now. By Friday, the story had been picked up by a local news station. They filmed from my dock, me and my flannel Barbara at my side, and Tommy behind the camera holding up his county badge as proof of the plan. They ran it at 6 o'clock. HOA overreach. Lakefront resident claims harassment by homeowners board. Within hours, my inbox exploded. People from other neighborhoods, other states, other victims. The next morning, HOA. Karen held a board meeting that was supposed to be private, but someone leaked the Zoom link. Hundreds of people joined, dozens recorded. And what they heard Karen ranting, raging, calling me a delusional veteran squatting on legacy land and promising to clean up the shoreline with or without the courts. The clip went viral. And suddenly, Karen wasn't just the face of a lake dispute. She was the face of entitled HOA tyranny. 3 days later, I received a handwritten letter. It wasn't from Karen. It was from her husband. A quiet man named Roger I'd seen twice mowing their lawn. He apologized, said he didn't know the full extent of what she'd been doing, said he supported my right to defend what was mine. Inside the envelope, a copy of their HOA resignation form, signed and notarized. Karen had been forced out. She hadn't told anyone yet, but her husband had seen enough. He'd had enough. And so had the board. But I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Karen might be gone. But the system she built was still there. Paperwork, policies, ordinances twisted into tools of harassment. If I didn't push back fully, it would happen again. To someone else. To someone without a green folder. Without a porch. Without a voice. 3 days after Karen was ousted, I drove into town with one goal: to make my ownership bulletproof. I'd already won the battle in public opinion and legal standing, but I knew from my years in uniform, victory isn't about surviving the ambush. It's about securing the perimeter so they can't strike again. So I walked into the Kainz County Registrar's office, green folder in hand, and requested a full historical title trace for Parcel 407B. The clerk, Miss Geraldine, the same one who'd helped me before, squinted over her glasses and smiled as she saw me. "Back to lay more landmines, Mr. Briggs?" she asked, only half joking. "Just reinforcing the fence," I said. "And this time I want it triple-checked and filed in every possible department: zoning, water rights, property, boundary, easement, dispute, historical register, if we can swing it." She chuckled. "You don't do anything halfway, do you, no, ma'am? Not when the wolves wear clipboards." We spent 3 hours going through old microfilm scans, dusty ledgers, and hand-drawn survey maps that hadn't seen daylight since Eisenhower was in office. And there it was. A 1959 topographic overlay, hand-inked by a civil engineer named Walter Kingsley. Not only did it show my grandfather's original cabin foundation, but it also clearly labeled the Platcom lakebed boundary as a privately held water right, under a clause from a now-defunct land grant. Geraldine leaned in, tapping the faded corner of the map with a crooked finger. "This right here, that's a unicorn. Most lakefront properties in this county only own up to the water line. Your grandfather bought the land when the lake was still being formed, before public charter claimed any of it." "So the lake isn't public?" I asked. "Nope. It was created through a private dam project. The HOA doesn't even have a legal easement to touch it. They've been bluffing this whole time." I stood there holding the copy in my hands, heart pounding. Everything I'd fought for, every insult, fine drone threat, had been built on a fantasy. And now I had the dragon-slaying sword in my hand. Back at the cabin, I scanned everything. The 1959 deed, the topographic overlay, the water rights clause, the zoning maps, the land grant trail, every page, every stamp, every legal boundary. I uploaded it all to a Dropbox folder titled HOA Truth Archive. Then I made 4 USB backups. One went in my safe, one to my lawyer Terry, one to Barbara, one mailed to a journalist in Atlanta who'd been covering corrupt HOAs for 5 years. If Karen or any future dictator in khaki pants wanted to try again, they'd have to go through a wall of truth thicker than my cabin's cedar beams. That night, I sat on the dock and watched the moon rise over the lake. The wind rippled across the water, and I felt something settle in me. Not pride, not triumph, but release. I thought of my grandfather, Earl Briggs, how he'd stood on this same shore hammering nails into wood, with no idea that 60 years later, his grandson would have to fight for the right to fish in peace. He'd taught me how to tie lures and sharpen a hatchet, but more importantly, he taught me how to hold my ground. The next morning, an unexpected knock on the door. It wasn't the HOA. It was a man in a suit, dark gray pressed clipboard in hand. He introduced himself as Brian Lasky, a real estate consultant hired by a private developer. Mr. Briggs, he began, we represent Lakeshore Vantage Properties, a group interested in developing high-end vacation homes along this shoreline. I raised an eyebrow. You mean on land you don't own? He smiled. Not yet. But we're acquiring parcels around the lake. With your location and rights, you'd be the crown jewel. What's the offer? I asked flat. $1.3 million, he said without hesitation. All cash, closing in 30 days. We'd clear the land, build modern lakefront villas. You walk away a millionaire. I didn't even blink. Not for sale. He blinked instead. Sir, I don't think you understand the opportunity. I stepped closer. No, you don't understand. This cabin is my home. That lake is my peace, and those documents you're waving don't mean squat unless you have a time machine to 1959. His smile faltered. He handed me a card anyway, and left with the silence of someone who'd lost a bidding war before it even began. I burned his card that evening in the fire pit, right on top of the old HOA fines I'd saved for the occasion. But the real moment of reckoning came a week later. I received a certified letter from the Kite HOA's new interim board. It was brief, and for once civil. Dear Mr. Briggs, the Evergreen Shores Board acknowledges receipt of your documented property ownership and recognizes that Parcel 407B, including associated water rights, is outside the jurisdiction of our HOA. We apologize for any distress or inconvenience caused by prior board actions. Effective immediately, any and all enforcement actions against your property are rescinded. Respectfully, Interim Board Secretary, Evergreen Shores. Oh, say. That was it. No groveling. No excuses. Just surrender. I placed the letter in the green folder, closed it, and locked it in the old desk drawer where my grandfather had kept it. Right beside his fishing knife and the photo of him on the day he finished building the dock, shirtless, grinning, holding a hammer. A few days later, Barbara and I co-hosted a pet community bonfire by the lake. No agenda. Just neighbors gathering under string lights and pine trees eating cornbread and smoked brisket, kids playing tag near the water, music humming from an old speaker. No HOA forms, no surveys, no Karen, just people. And as the fire crackled, someone handed me a guitar. I strummed a few chords, rusty but familiar, and I remembered something I hadn't felt in years. Freedom. Not the kind that comes with medals or papers, but the kind you earn 1 inch at a time by standing your ground and saying, "This is mine, and I'm not leaving." The victory tasted sweet, but it left behind a oft aftertaste of something deeper unfinished. I could have stopped right there. I had my cabin, the lake, the letter of surrender. Karen was gone. The board had backed off. But that quiet voice inside, the same one that whispered when enemy boots shifted in the sand or when a convoy route didn't feel right, was still talking. It said, "There's more under the surface." So I kept digging. I started with public records. Thanks to Tommy Wilkes at the Planning Commission, I had access to zoning change proposals, water use petitions, and environmental studies. I spent days in the county archives poring over PDFs and microfiche scans from the past 5 years. What I found stunned me. Karen's lakefront takeover had been just one part of a larger plan. There were documents detailing a Boisson proposed redevelopment project, a rebranding of the entire Winding Pine Lake area as a boutique vacation corridor. It wasn't just about me. It was about everyone around the lake. Property by property, Evergreen Shores had been quietly acquiring land, enforcing arbitrary codes, and filing zoning change requests to convert residential lots into short-term luxury rentals. The scheme was complex, legally gray, financially aggressive, and morally bankrupt. And it was already halfway done. They'd bought out 3 older residents on the North Shore through scare tactics and lowball offers. They'd quietly rezoned 2 buffer lots for lake access infrastructure, which they used to push for grant money from the state's tourism department. Karen hadn't been acting alone. Behind her funding, it all was a man named Douglas Vance, a private developer and former hedge fund manager who had started a shell company. Lakeshore Vantage Properties. The same man who sent Brian Lasky to offer me $1.3 million. It wasn't coincidence. It was conquest. I compiled everything: ownership maps, campaign contributions from Vance to local board candidates, emails leaked by an anonymous HOA board member who'd finally grown a conscience. Then I got a call from Vanessa McCain, a reporter from the state's largest newspaper. She'd seen the local piece about my story and wanted to go deeper. I gave her everything: the archive, the footage, the maps, the blueprint of manipulation that stretched all around the lake. And when she asked me why, I told her the truth. Because if they get away with this here, they'll try it again, somewhere else. To someone who doesn't have a green folder or a voice or a doc to stand on. She published the article the next Sunday. Front page. Lake Under Siege. How one HOA tried to privatize a community. Within 48 hours, the county announced an all-official audit of Evergreen Shores HOA and its land use applications. Within 72, a state attorney opened an investigation into Lakeshore Vantage Properties and potential fraud. Douglas Vance went silent. His company website vanished. So did the coming soon banners around the northern ridge. And one by one, neighbors started knocking on my door, not to complain, but to thank me. But it wasn't just the lake that changed. The people around it did too. Barbara, who once kept to herself, was now leading community meetings. Tommy, once quiet and careful, started a website sharing real-time updates about HOA transparency. And others who'd been pushed around, Ella Martinez, whose dock was destroyed at night. The Sings, fined for their windmill, were finally speaking up. We created a new council, not a HOA, but a cooperative watch group, built on respect, not rules. We called it Lake Keepers. We didn't have dues. We had trust. Karen. She moved out 2 weeks later. Her house sold at a loss. Rumors swirled that her husband filed for divorce. I didn't smile when I heard it. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt done. Like the storm had passed. And yet one evening I found myself back at the old desk, green folder in hand, adding the final document, Vanessa's article, folded neatly behind the original deed. I closed it, locked the drawer. Then I walked to the dock as the sun dipped behind the trees. The lake shimmered gold, birds chattered. A loon cried in the distance. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was holding my breath. I sat on the edge of the dock, with my boots off and my feet in the water. I thought of the veterans I'd served with, the ones who'd made it home, the ones who hadn't. I thought of my grandfather hammering these planks in the summer of '59. of my father teaching me to fish here, of all the moments this place had given me, the healing, the clarity, the silence. I'd almost let someone take that away. Not just the land, but the meaning in it. But not anymore. Not ever again. As twilight settled and fireflies blinked into life, I whispered the same words I'd said the night I first stood up to Karen. Only this time I wasn't angry. I was grateful. You picked the wrong veteran, but also, you reminded me what I stand for. The courthouse was quiet that morning, too quiet for a case that had lit up the community like a brush fire. I walked through its heavy glass doors carrying a black leather briefcase. Not a military satchel or a combat pack, but one borrowed from my friend Terry. I'd told him I wanted to look like someone they couldn't ignore. Inside the courtroom, a few scattered locals had already taken their seats. Barbara was in the front row, arms folded, sharp eyes scanning every corner. Tommy sat beside her legal pad in hand. Behind them were neighbors' faces I'd only seen in passing, now showing up like family. And directly across from us sat the new HOA board members, freshly scrubbed and tightly wound. They looked less like defendants and more like interns afraid to speak without permission. At the center of them sat the lawyer hired by Evergreen Shores, a man named Clifford Yale. Slick gray suit, narrow tie, crooked smile. Karen wasn't present. She'd already resigned, and rumor had it she'd moved to Florida. But this wasn't about her anymore. It was about what she'd left behind. The county judge was a wiry man in his early 60s, Judge Manning. No nonsense. No frills. After swearing us all in, he got straight to the point. This hearing is to determine whether the Evergreen Shores HOA, through its former and current board members, acted in excess of its authority in attempting to enforce jurisdiction over Parcel 407B and its owner, Mr. Samuel Briggs. He looked down at the file in front of him. I've read the documentation. I've seen the land deed, the zoning records, and the correspondence from both parties. Today I'm here to hear testimony and determine whether this HOA acted in good faith or in calculated overreach. He motioned for the HOA side to begin. Yale stood slowly, buttoned his jacket, and started what I could only describe as a polite con job. He spoke of misunderstandings, unfortunate miscommunications, and a sincere desire for community cohesion. He insisted that the HOA had only ever wanted to protect the value of surrounding properties. Then, like icing on a cake baked from lies, he added. Mr. Briggs's reaction, while passionate, created a hostile narrative that unfairly characterized the board's intentions. Barbara scoffed out loud. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Ms. Gray, permission to cough," she said with a smile. Yale tried not to flinch. Then it was my turn. I didn't rise dramatically. I didn't shout or point fingers. I simply stood and opened the briefcase. This, I said, is what happens when people with power forget they're not above the law. One by one, I placed documents on the presentation table. 1. My grandfather's 1959 deed. The original waterbed ownership clause. Certified survey maps. HOA fine notices. Photos of survey stakes driven into my land. Video stills of drones flying over my roof. The sheriff's report from their failed enforcement visit. The letter from the FAA confirming my drone complaint. 9. The developer's proposal including my cabin in their Marina Plan 10. Vanessa McCain's article with the county audit findings. The courtroom was silent. Not a rustle. Not a whisper. Judge Manning leaned forward, studying the documents with a kind of stillness I recognized from battlefield commanders. When I finished, I stepped back and said, "I'm not here to gloat. I'm here because if this happened to me, a man trained to spot manipulation with access to legal help, then what happens to a widow? A young couple, a retired teacher, I paused. I stood my ground, not because I like fighting. I did it because I had to. Because what they did wasn't just a nuisance. It was an assault on ownership, freedom, and dignity. The judge nodded once and motioned for the board. None of them spoke. Not a single one. He turned to Yale. Anything further, Yale licked his lips. No, Your Honor. The decision came after a brief recess. Judge Manning returned and read from a prepared statement. After reviewing the evidence and hearing testimony, I find that the Evergreen Shores HOA acted outside its legal jurisdiction in its attempts to fine, harass, and otherwise coerce Mr. Briggs into compliance with standards that do not apply to his property. He turned to me. Mr. Briggs, you are entitled to damages. You may file a civil claim. But more importantly, let this stand as record: your land, your cabin, your dock, and your water rights are legally untouchable by this HOA or any entity attempting to exploit your land without proper authority. Then he addressed the board. This court strongly encourages Evergreen Shores to review its charter bylaws and enforcement practices. The era of unchecked authority is over. He banged the gavel. And just like that, justice was done. The parking lot outside the courthouse felt like a victory parade. Neighbors clapped me on the back. Barbara hugged me like a sister. Tommy handed me a printed copy of the court order like it was a medal. But I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. Like the foundation beneath my feet had settled, no longer shifting under someone else's greed. That night back at the cabin, I opened the screen door and stepped into the dark. The moon was high. The lake was silver. The air smelled like pine and old paper. I sat on the dock with a glass of bourbon and whispered to the still water. We did it. Not I, we. Because none of it would have happened without the people who stood beside me. Without Barbara's courage. Tommy's warnings, Terry's legal firepower, the strangers who became neighbors, the neighbors who became defenders. This lake didn't just belong to me. It belonged to all of us. And together, we reclaimed it. By the end of summer, it felt like everything had changed. The lake was quieter, peaceful, not because it lacked activity, but because the tension that once hung like humidity over the shoreline had finally lifted. No more HOA notices. No golf carts cruising the ridge like patrols. No strangers photographing my windows under the guise of compliance documentation. But the final reckoning didn't come in the courthouse. It came under fluorescent lights in a community center gymnasium with a broken microphone and 70 folding chairs. The fall HOA meeting had been rescheduled twice after Karen's resignation. The new interim board finally set a date, posted flyers, and probably against their better judgment, opened it to the public. Barbara and I arrived early. We didn't sit near the front. We didn't come to heckle or gloat. We came because people needed to hear what really happened. At 6:03 p.m., the room was full, standing room only. Residents who had never attended a meeting in years now leaned against the back walls. Couples from the new developments. Elderly owners with yellowed HOA handbooks clutched like old Bibles. And younger folks, first-time homeowners, visibly skeptical, looking for clarity in a world of rules they'd never agreed to. At the center of it all sat a simple folding table with name placards and plastic water bottles. The interim board looked nervous. But Karen. She was there too. She wasn't supposed to be. But at 6:07 she walked in, hair shorter, face tighter, a brittle version of the woman who once stood on my land, like she owned the soil beneath it. People noticed. Whispers started. A few faces hardened. She took a seat in the third row, arms crossed, expression unreadable. The meeting began with formalities, budget updates, landscaping projects, waterline repairs. People fidgeted, waited. Then, as if on cue, the interim chair cleared his throat. We'd now like to address the recent developments concerning property jurisdiction and the legal resolution involving Parcel 407B. The air tightened. He looked toward me. Mr. Briggs, would you care to speak? I stood slowly, papers in hand, but I didn't walk to the front. I turned around, facing the audience, not the board, and I told them everything. Not just about the harassment, not just about the drone, the fines, the threats, but the intentional design, the pattern, the system. How Evergreen Shores had become a machine that punished nonconformity and fed on silence. I spoke plainly, calmly, like I was briefing a room full of soldiers before a mission. I explained the marina plans, the buffer zone fraud, the illegal filings. Then I pulled from my folder a single sheet, the judge's final ruling. Parcel 407B has never been and shall never be under the authority of this HOA, I read aloud. Any attempts to enforce such authority were and remain unlawful. Silence. Then from the back, a man raised his hand. Why wasn't this disclosed? He asked. My family was told we'd have exclusive lake access if we bought on the East Shore. Another woman stood up. They fined me for planting lavender. Lavender a third. They made me repaint my shutters twice in 6 months. And then finally, a voice cracking and hesitant. Karen. They asked for order, she said, low but clear. I tried to preserve value. I followed procedure. You created procedure, someone snapped. You ran this place like a private empire. Karen stood up slowly, as if realizing she couldn't hide anymore. She turned toward the crowd, eyes wet, but chin still high. You don't understand what it's like to hold this community together. The meetings, the complaints, the constant pressure. Someone had to make the hard calls. No, Barbara said softly from beside me. Someone just had to listen. And that broke something. Karen sat back down. Not in defiance, not in defeat, just small. Like the uniform she'd worn for years had been peeled away, leaving nothing but a tired woman behind. What happened next wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no marching her out, no vote or spectacle, just a quiet motion from the board. Motion to permanently dissolve enforcement authority over Parcel 407B and any surrounding zones misrepresented in prior filings. Approved, unanimously. Then a second. Motion to initiate an independent audit of all HOA actions taken during the prior administration and to publish a full report to homeowners within 90 days. Approved. With applause. Karen didn't move. She just sat there staring ahead while the community she'd tried to control reclaimed itself one vote at a time. After the meeting, people stayed. They formed small circles, talked, laughed, compared stories not just of injustice but of resilience. It felt less like a hearing, more like a town revival. One by one, neighbors approached me. They shook my hand, thanked me, shared their own run-ins, their own quiet battles they'd never thought they could win. I told them the same thing each time. You don't need to fight with fire. You just need to know where the firewood is and who's been lighting the matches. Later that night, back at the cabin, I sat on the porch, listening to the frogs call across the lake. A full moon hung low, reflecting off the water, like a silver eye. Barbara called to check in. Tommy sent me a photo from the meeting, Karen in the background, small and alone, half-shadowed. I didn't feel vindictive. I didn't feel cruel. I just felt done. Like a storm that had finally rained itself out. In my journal that night, I wrote one line: "You can defeat a tyrant, but it takes a village to unlearn obedience." I closed the book, took one last sip of bourbon, and let the silence return. Fall turned to winter with a hush. The last leaves fluttered down from the sycamores along the lake's edge, and frost began to gather on the railing of my porch. The tourist noise faded, the boats went into storage, and the lake finally was still. But something had changed permanently. Not in the water, not in the trees, not even in the HOA bylaws or board rosters. It had changed in us, in the people who called this place home. The weeks after the community meeting saw a quiet revolution unfold. The audit completed by a third-party law firm revealed layers of abuse and negligence that stunned even the skeptics. Karen had created nearly a dozen informal policies that were never ratified, rules she enforced through threat and intimidation alone. Thousands of dollars in fines had been collected. Nearly half of them were issued under ordinances that had no legal grounding. The board, now fully restructured and led by a soft-spoken former teacher named Miss Elaine, voted to return every dollar collected unlawfully. They mailed apology letters. They canceled every open violation left behind by Karen's reign. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was a beginning. As for me, I didn't return to isolation. Not this time. Neighbors started visiting more. Some brought homemade bread. Others came with questions about deeds, survey lines, or just to sit on the dock and watch the geese drift across the lake like floating poems. Barbara convinced me to speak at the town library for a citizens and land rights panel. I wore jeans and my best flannel. Told my story not like a hero, but like a man who refused to bow. At the end, a teenager raised his hand and asked, "Would you go through it all again, knowing what you know now?" I paused. Thought about the months of stress, the threats, the lawsuits, the looks of doubt, the nights alone on the dock, wondering if I was the crazy one. And then I said, yes. Because a home isn't just walls and wood. It's the space between silence and safety. And nobody has the right to take that from you. They clapped. I blushed. Barbara cried. By spring, our little lake had transformed. Not physically. There were still potholes on the gravel roads and the occasional raccoon raid on garbage bins. But the energy, it was different. The lake keepers grew into something real. We hosted cleanup days, planted trees, created a community dock open to all, funded by a handful of us, who remembered what it was like to be told you don't belong here. We posted signs not to keep people out, but to invite them in. Winding Pine Lake is shared by all. Respect the water. Respect each other. No HOA jurisdiction beyond this point. People took photos with the sign like it was a monument. In a way it was. A monument to common sense, to boundaries respected, to people remembered. Then one sunny afternoon in May, I received a letter, handwritten, postmarked from Sarasota, Florida. It was from Karen. The envelope contained no return address, no apology, just a folded sheet of ivory stationery in elegant cursive ink. Samuel. I may never understand what drove you to fight so hard. But I suppose part of me admires it. The lake was never mine to control. But I believed I was doing what no one else would. Maybe now you will. I read it twice. Then folded it, placed it in the green folder, and tucked it away with everything else. I didn't need closure, but sometimes knowing the storm knows your name is enough. On the first anniversary of the final hearing, we held a barbecue by the water. Dozens of families came. Kids splashed along the shallows. Dogs barked. Music played from a Bluetooth speaker resting on a cooler of lemonade. I stood at the grill in a worn apron that read, "Dock Commander." Barbara brought potato salad. Tommy brought his baby girl swaddled in a fleece with tiny ducks. Even Miss Elaine came still carrying her leather-bound HOA manual like a relic, though these days she only used it as a coaster. As the sun began to set, a hush fell over the group. People gathered by the dock, watching the orange blaze ripple across the lake's surface. I stepped forward, beer in hand, and said just 3 words. "We're still here." And that was enough. Later that night, after the last chair had been folded and the final marshmallow roasted, I walked down to the water alone. The air smelled like charcoal and honeysuckle. The frogs were singing again. The moon hung low, fat and glowing. I stood at the edge of the dock, barefoot toes curled over the wood. Then I crouched, dipped my hand into the lake and whispered, "You're safe now." It was never just about the land, or the dock, or even the lake. It was about defending a piece of peace, in a world that too often takes without asking. And in doing so, I found something I hadn't expected. Not vengeance, not victory, but belonging. Some battles are fought with bullets, others with truth, and some with cedar boards, old maps, and the steady hand of a man who refuses to be moved. That was my battle. That is my home. That lake belongs to the people now, and it always will.